The first thing Margaret noticed when she woke that morning was the silence, not the hollow, fearful silence that had blanketed the valley for 3 years. But something new, something almost forgotten, the silence of possibility. Through the window of her cottage, she could see Thomas crossing the green with his shoulders back, no longer hunched against invisible contagion, and for the first time since the sickness came, he was whistling. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Margaret rose from her bed and dressed in the gray light of dawn, her hands moving through the familiar motions of lacing her bodice and pinning her hair. She descended the narrow stairs to the kitchen, where the hearth still held embers from the night before. As she coaxed the fire back to life and set the kettle to boil, she thought of all the mornings she had performed these same tasks, while the world outside grew darker and darker. How many times had she stood in this very spot, listening to the church bells toll for another funeral, another family broken? The village of Millbrook had been, before the plague, a prosperous market town of some 300 souls. Nestled in a valley where 3 rivers met, it had thrived on the wool trade and the fertility of the surrounding farmland. The Haywards had farmed the same 100 acres for time out of mind. Then came the spring of 1665, and with it, the sickness. It arrived on a Tuesday in late April, carrying the body of a traveling merchant who had stopped at the inn for the night. By Thursday, he was dead. By Sunday, the innkeeper's wife was fevered and delirious. Within a month, 40 people had perished. Within 3 months, half the village lay in the churchyard. Margaret remembered those days with a clarity that sometimes overwhelmed her. She remembered the smell of vinegar and smoke from the fires they kept burning, trying to purify the air. But that was then. This was now. And now, somehow, impossibly, the plague had loosened its grip and departed as mysteriously as it had come. Margaret poured her tea and sat at the table, watching the light strengthen beyond her window. Today was market day, the first proper market day in 3 years. Or perhaps not what it had been, she thought, but something new, something forged in the fire of loss and hardship. They were not the people they had been 3 years ago. How could they be? Every person who had survived carried scars, visible and invisible. She finished her tea and rinsed the cup, then wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the morning. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard behind the church. Across the green, she could see others emerging from their homes, moving toward the market square with a tentative eagerness that reminded her of animals venturing out after a long winter. Sarah Wickham was setting up her bread stall, her strong arms arranging the loaves in neat rows. She had lost her husband and 2 of her 4 children to the plague, but she had survived, and she had kept her oven burning through all the dark days, providing bread for those who could afford to buy it, and sometimes for those who could not. Margaret made her way over to her. "Good morning, Sarah," she said. "Your bread smells wonderful." Sarah looked up and smiled. A real smile, not the tight, anxious grimace that had passed for a smile during the plague years. "Margaret, it's good to see you. I've made extra today." Had a feeling people might be hungry for more than just bread, if you know what I mean. Margaret nodded. Hungry for normalcy, for connection. Just so. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. "Though I confess I'm nervous too. What if we've forgotten how to do this? How to be ... together? Then we'll remember," Margaret said. "Or we'll learn again." More people were arriving now. John Ashford, the wheelwright, carried a bundle of spokes and a freshly repaired cartwheel. Mary Thornton had jars of honey from her hives, golden in the morning light. Young William Chase, not so young anymore, Margaret realized. The boy had become a man during the plague years, was leading a cow with a calf at her side, the first new calf born in the village in more than a year. The market began to take shape around them, stall by stall, conversation by conversation. It was tentative at first, people speaking in low voices, still maintaining the careful distance that had become second nature. But gradually, as the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, something shifted. Voices grew louder. Laughter rang out, surprising, infectious laughter. Someone began to sing, and others joined in. Margaret found herself standing at the edge of the market, watching it all with tears in her eyes. She wasn't sure if they were tears of joy or sorrow or both. Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps tears were simply tears, and the heart knew what it needed to release. "It's something, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. She turned to find Robert Harding, the parish priest, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall man with kind eyes and hair that had gone entirely white during the plague years. Though he was not yet 50, he had buried more than half his flock and had nearly died himself of the sickness. But he had survived, and he had stayed, and his presence had been an anchor for many when everything else seemed to be falling away. "It is," Margaret agreed. "I almost can't believe it's real." "I know what you mean." Father Robert watched the market with the same expression of wonder and relief that Margaret felt. "There were days I thought we'd never see this again. Days I questioned whether God had abandoned us entirely." "And did he?" The priest was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally, and there was such honesty in his voice that Margaret felt a surge of affection for him. "I truly don't know. I said all the proper words, offered all the proper prayers, but I couldn't see his purpose in any of it. All that suffering, all that loss. If there was a reason, it's beyond my understanding." "Perhaps that's enough," Margaret said. "To admit we don't understand. To stop pretending we have answers when we don't. Perhaps," Father Robert smiled slightly, "though it's a hard thing for a priest to say to his congregation. They look to me for certainty, for assurance. What do I give them instead? Doubt? Questions?" "Maybe that's what they need," Margaret said. "Maybe we've all had enough of false certainty. Maybe it's time to live with the questions." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the market grow and flourish. Margaret noticed small moments of grace everywhere she looked. Two women who had been rivals before the plague, now standing with their heads together, talking and laughing. A man lifting a child high in the air, while the child shrieked with delight. An old woman sitting on a bench, simply watching it all with a smile of deep contentment on her weathered face. As the morning progressed, Margaret made her purchases: a loaf of Sarah's bread, a small jar of honey, some spring onions from Edmund Carter's garden. But more than goods, she found herself trading stories. Everyone wanted to talk, to share where they had been and what they had endured and how they had survived. It was as if the long silence of the plague years had created a dam, and now the waters were finally breaking through. She spoke with Agnes Miller, whose husband had kept the mill running even when there was barely enough grain to grind. "I don't know how he did it," Agnes said, shaking her head. "Day after day, when it seemed like the whole world was dying. But he said the mill had to keep turning. Said that as long as the wheel turned, there was hope." She spoke with Thomas Wickham, Sarah's eldest son, who had been only 15 when the plague came and was now a young man of 18, sober beyond his years. "I felt like I was living in a dream," he told her. "A bad dream that wouldn't end. But I couldn't let my mother see how frightened I was. She needed me to be strong." She spoke with Elizabeth Ashford, who had lost her only daughter but had taken in 2 orphan children from a neighboring village. "I thought my heart would never heal," Elizabeth said quietly. "But these little ones, they remind me that life goes on. That love goes on." By noon, the market was in full swing, more vital and alive than Margaret could remember seeing it even before the plague. Perhaps that was the strange alchemy of survival, that having come so close to losing everything, people treasured what remained all the more fiercely. She was making her way home, her basket heavy with purchases, when she nearly collided with a stranger, a man of perhaps 35, with dark hair and watchful eyes, leading a horse laden with packs. "I beg your pardon," he said, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "No harm done," Margaret said, studying him curiously. Strangers had been rare during the plague years, and the sight of an unfamiliar face was both exciting and slightly unsettling. "Are you new to Millbrook?" "I am," he said. "My name is Daniel Merrick. I'm a stonemason by trade. I heard your village had weathered the plague and might be in need of skilled hands for repairs and rebuilding." "We are," Margaret said, "though I'm surprised you'd want to come here, knowing we've had the sickness." Daniel's expression grew serious. "I've seen the plague myself, in London and in other towns. Lost my wife and young son to it 2 years past. After that, I wandered for a time, taking work where I could find it, trying to outrun the grief. But I've learned you can't outrun such things. Better to find a place to settle and build something new." Margaret felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss. I lost my sister to the plague. And so many others, friends, neighbors. Half the village, in the end. Then you understand," Daniel said simply, "the weight of it. The emptiness." "I do." She hesitated, then said, "You'll want to speak with Father Robert about work. The church needs some repair, and there are houses that have stood empty and fallen into disrepair. But I should warn you, we're a changed people. The plague has marked us all. All the more reason to be here," Daniel said. "Marked people understand each other in ways that others cannot." He touched his cap to her. "Thank you for the welcome. I hope we'll speak again." As Margaret watched him lead his horse toward the church, she felt a stirring of something she couldn't quite name. Not attraction, exactly, though he was handsome enough. More a sense of recognition, as if she had glimpsed in him some mirror of her own journey through darkness toward light. She continued home and spent the afternoon in quiet domesticity, putting away her purchases, mending a torn petticoat, tending her small garden. But her mind kept returning to the market, to the sense of renewal and possibility that had infused everything. And to the stranger, Daniel Merrick, with his grief-worn eyes and his talk of building something new. As the sun began its descent toward evening, she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Father Robert on her doorstep. "Margaret, forgive the intrusion," he said, "but I wanted to ask if you'd consider taking on a task for the village." "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "What do you need?" The priest settled into a chair by the hearth, accepting the cup of ale she poured for him. "As you know, during the plague, we lost not only people, but also much of our community's organization and record-keeping. The rolls that listed landholdings, births, marriages, deaths, many were lost or fell into disarray. I've been trying to reconstruct them, but it's work that requires someone with a clear mind and a good memory. Someone who knew the village before the plague and knows who remains now." "You want me to help you rebuild the records," Margaret said. "More than that, I want you to become the village clerk, to keep the records going forward and to help me establish what we've lost from the past. It's important work, Margaret. Without proper records, disputes arise. Property claims become muddled. History itself begins to fade." Margaret considered this. She had been a merchant's wife before the plague, had helped her husband keep his accounts and manage his business. After his death, not from plague, but from a fall from his horse in the first year of the sickness, she had lived quietly, surviving on the money he had left her and the income from renting out his shop. The idea of taking on official work for the village was both daunting and appealing. "Why me?" she asked. Father Robert smiled. "Because you're observant, because people trust you, because you have the education and the skills, and because I think you need something to devote yourself to, something larger than your own grief. Am I wrong?" Margaret looked down at her hands, at the way they had begun to fold and unfold the edge of her apron, a nervous habit she had developed during the plague years. "No," she said softly, "you're not wrong. Sometimes I feel as if I'm just existing, going through the motions. I need purpose." "Then will you do it?" "Yes," she said, feeling something shift inside her as she spoke the word. "Yes, I'll do it." They spent the next hour discussing the particulars, where she would work, what materials she would need, how she would begin the enormous task of reconstruction. By the time Father Robert left, the sun had set, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Margaret stood in her doorway, watching him walk back across the green toward the rectory. The village was settling into evening, smoke rising from chimneys, lamplight glowing in windows. It looked peaceful, almost normal, but she knew that behind every door was a story of loss and survival, of grief endured and hope slowly, painfully rekindled. She thought of Daniel Merrick, the stonemason, with his talk of building something new. Perhaps that was what they were all doing now, in their different ways, building something new from the ruins of what had been. Not replacing what was lost, which was impossible, but creating something else, something shaped by both memory and possibility. That night, she dreamed of her sister Anne. In the dream, they were children again, running through summer fields, their laughter rising like birdsong. When she woke, she found tears on her cheeks, but they felt different from the bitter tears she had cried during the plague years. These tears were gentler, tinged with sweetness as well as sorrow. The next morning, Margaret presented herself at the church to begin her new duties. Father Robert had prepared a small room adjacent to the sacristy for her use, with a table, a chair, ink and paper, and several leather-bound ledgers in various states of completion. The last clerk died in the first wave of the plague, the priest explained. His son tried to continue the work, but died himself a few months later. Since then, I've done what I could, but I'm no clerk. My handwriting is abysmal, and I haven't the head for organization that such work requires. Margaret examined the ledgers. The records were indeed in disarray, with gaps and inconsistencies throughout. Some entries were complete, others merely fragmentary. Whole months were missing entirely. It was like trying to read a book from which half the pages had been torn out. "I'll need to interview people," she said, "to fill in the gaps. Some won't want to revisit those times, but it must be done." "I know," Father Robert said, "and that's partly why I thought of you. You have a gentle way about you. People will tell you things they might not tell someone else." Over the following weeks, Margaret immersed herself in the work. She began systematically, starting with the most recent records and working backward. She interviewed villagers, asking them about births and deaths, marriages and property transfers. Some spoke freely, even finding relief in the telling. Others were more reticent, their pain still too raw. Agnes Miller wept as she recounted the deaths of her two youngest children, both taken by the plague within days of each other. They were 5 and 7, she said, so small. They should have had their whole lives ahead of them. Thomas Blackwood, who had lost his father and 2 brothers, spoke with a flatness that Margaret recognized as the numbness of overwhelming grief. "What does it matter now?" he said. "They're gone. Writing their names in a book won't bring them back." "No," Margaret agreed gently, "but it will ensure they're remembered, that they're not forgotten. Surely that matters." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw his eyes fill with tears that he blinked back fiercely. "Yes," he said at last. "Yes, I suppose it does." As she worked, Margaret began to see patterns in the chaos. The plague had not been random in its devastation. It had struck hardest in the crowded center of the village, where people lived in close proximity. The outlying farms had suffered less, though none had been entirely spared. The young and the old had died in disproportionate numbers, but the plague had also claimed many in the prime of life men and women who should have had decades ahead of them. She also began to understand the full extent of what had been lost. It wasn't just the deaths themselves, though those were devastating enough. It was the disruption of all normal patterns and relationships. Apprenticeships had been broken off. Betrothals had been dissolved. Children had been orphaned and taken in by relatives or neighbors, their futures fundamentally altered. Businesses had failed. Farms had been abandoned. The careful web of social and economic relationships that had held the community together had been torn apart. And yet, as she spoke with people and recorded their stories, Margaret also saw evidence of resilience and adaptation. William Chase, now the village's primary herdsman, had been a baker's apprentice before the plague. When his master died and the bakery closed, he had turned to the work his grandfather had done, tending cattle and sheep. "I never thought I'd be a herdsman," he told Margaret, "but I found I had a gift for it, the animals. They don't care about the past. They live in the present moment. There's something freeing about that." Mary Thornton, the beekeeper, had been a seamstress before the plague. When the demand for fancy dresses disappeared, who needed fine clothing when everyone was dying? She had turned to beekeeping, taking over her late husband's hives. "The bees kept me sane," she said. "They have their own rhythm, their own order. Watching them work, seeing how they build and maintain their hive. It reminded me that life continues, even in the midst of death." These stories of transformation fascinated Margaret. It was as if the plague, in destroying the old ways, had also freed people to discover new capacities within themselves. The rigid structures that had defined who could do what work and when had been loosened by necessity. Women had taken on traditionally male roles. Young people had assumed responsibilities that would normally have come much later in life. The village was being rebuilt, not just physically but socially, with new patterns emerging from the ruins of the old. One afternoon, about a month into her new work, Margaret was walking home when she encountered Daniel Merrick again. He was working on the wall of a cottage that had stood empty since its owner had died of the plague. His shirt was off, despite the spring coolness, and his back was slick with sweat. "Mr. Merrick," she said, "I see you found work." He turned and smiled, wiping his brow with his forearm. "Mrs. Ashworth." "Margaret Ashworth." "Mrs. Ashworth." "Yes. Father Robert has kept me busy. There's more work than I can easily manage, truth be told. Half the buildings in the village need some form of repair." "I suppose that's to be expected," Margaret said. "When survival is the only priority, maintenance falls by the wayside." "Just so." He gestured to the wall he was working on. "This cottage has good bones, but it's been empty for more than 2 years. The roof needs work. Several stones have come loose, and the dampness has gotten into the walls. But it can be saved. It will be a good home for someone again." "Who will live here?" "The Carvers, I'm told. They've been living with relatives since their own house burned in a fire last winter. They have 3 young children." Margaret nodded. She had met the Carvers during her interviews, a weary-looking couple who had survived the plague only to lose their home to an accident with a cooking fire. "They'll be grateful to have their own space again." "I hope so." Daniel picked up his tools. "Father Robert tells me you're doing important work as well. Recording the village's history, setting things in order." "I'm trying," Margaret said, "though it feels overwhelming sometimes. There's so much lost to document, so many gaps to fill, but necessary work," Daniel said. "A community needs to know its own story, needs to remember." "You sound as if you speak from experience." He was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on his tools. "My wife kept a diary," he said finally. Every day she would write in it not just about what happened, but about what she thought and felt. After she died, I found years' worth of her thoughts, her observations about the world. Reading them ... was like she was still speaking to me, still present in some way. That must have been a comfort. It was, and a torment, but mostly a comfort. He looked at Margaret directly. "What you're doing, Mrs. Ashworth, it's like that. You're preserving voices that might otherwise be lost." ensuring that people's lives meant something, that they're not just forgotten. Margaret felt tears break her eyes. Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I wonder if anyone cares, if it matters. It matters, Daniel said firmly. Believe me, it matters. They talked for a few more minutes, and Margaret found herself enjoying his company. There was a steadiness about him, a quiet strength that reminded her of her late husband. When she finally continued home, she realized she was smiling. As spring turned toward summer, the village continued its slow return to life. The fields were planted and tended. The market grew more robust week by week. Children played on the green again, their shouts and laughter a sound that had been absent for too long. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of grief, still nights when the weight of loss seemed unbearable. But there was also joy, fragile and tentative but real. Margaret's work as clerk continued to expand. Beyond just recording births, deaths, and property transfers, she found herself becoming a kind of unofficial counselor and mediator. She advised a widow on how to manage her late husband's debts. She also continued her conversations with various villagers, not just for the purpose of record keeping, but simply to understand what they had experienced and how they were coping now. These conversations revealed the complex emotional landscape that lay beneath the surface of daily life. James Holbrook, a farmer in his 60s, spoke of his guilt at surviving when his wife and sons had perished. Perhaps sense isn't what we should be seeking, Margaret suggested gently. Perhaps we simply have to accept that some things can't be understood. But what do I do with this life I still have? Margaret didn't have easy answers, but she listened, and sometimes that was enough. Young Catherine Marsh, barely 20, spoke of her fear of forming new attachments. She had been engaged before the plague, but her betrothed had died in the first wave. But if you wall yourself off, Margaret said, if you refuse to love, haven't you already lost something vital? Catherine looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. But how do you bear it? The risk? I don't know, Margaret admitted. I'm still learning that myself. Indeed, as the weeks passed, Margaret found herself thinking more and more about risk and connection. Her conversations with Daniel Merrick had become more frequent. They would encounter each other around the village and fall into easy conversation. He told her about his work, the satisfaction he found in repairing and building. She told him about her role as clerk, the stories she was gathering, the portrait of the community that was emerging from her work. One evening in late June, Daniel appeared at her door with a basket. I know it's presumptuous, he said, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. But I've been fishing, and I caught more than I can eat myself. I thought perhaps I'd be happy to share them, Margaret said, opening the door wider. Would you like to come in? I have some vegetables from the garden, and some of Sarah's bread. We could have supper together. It was the first meal she had shared with a man since her husband's death, and she found herself nervous in a way she hadn't expected. But as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing the fish and vegetables, the nervousness faded into something more comfortable. They talked and laughed, sharing stories from their respective pasts. Daniel told her about growing up in Yorkshire, the son of a stonemason who had taught him the trade. I loved working with stone, he said, the solidity of it, the way it endures. Wood rots, metal rusts, but stone remains. And yet even stone crumbles eventually, Margaret observed. True, but not in our lifetime. There's something reassuring about that. About working with a material that will outlast you, that will stand as testament to your skill long after you're gone. Margaret told him about her marriage, about the merchant's life she had led before the plague. We were happy, she said, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way of two people who understood each other. When he died, I felt unmoored, as if I'd lost not just a husband, but my sense of who I was. And now? Daniel asked gently. Now I'm finding a new sense of who I am. The clerk, the record keeper. Someone who matters to the community in a different way. It's strange, but also good. After they ate, they sat by the hearth, talking into the evening. Margaret found herself telling Daniel things she hadn't told anyone about her fears during the plague, about the nightmares that still sometimes woke her, about her struggle to find meaning in survival. I used to believe things happened for a reason, she said, that there was some divine plan, some purpose behind suffering. But the plague ... it destroyed that belief. I can't see any purpose in so much death, so much pain, and yet here we are, Daniel said, still alive, still trying to build something meaningful. Perhaps that's the purpose, not in the suffering itself, but in what we make of what comes after. Margaret looked at him, at the way the firelight played across his features, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. You're a philosopher as well as a stonemason, she said lightly. He smiled. Stone teaches patience and perspective. When you're working with something that's been around for millions of years, your own troubles seem smaller somehow. When he finally left, well, after dark, Margaret stood in her doorway, watching him walk away across the green. The night was warm and clear, stars scattered across the sky like seeds. She realized that something had shifted in her. Some ice that had formed around her heart during the plague years was beginning to thaw. The next morning, she woke with a sense of anticipation that surprised her. She dressed with more care than usual, pinning her hair just so, choosing her best everyday dress. At the church, she threw herself into her work with renewed energy. Father Robert noticed the change. You seemed cheerful this morning, he observed. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. Do I? I suppose I slept well. The priest smiled knowingly, but said nothing more, for which Margaret was grateful. As July arrived, the village prepared for the Midsummer Festival, the first proper celebration since before the plague. There was debate about whether it was appropriate, whether it was too soon to celebrate when so many had died. But eventually, the consensus was that the living needed to celebrate life, needed to affirm that they had survived and would continue. The preparations became a community effort. Garlands were woven from summer flowers. Tables were set up on the green. Food was prepared, more food than had been seen in one place since before the plague. There would be dancing and music, contests and games, everything that made a traditional midsummer celebration. Margaret found herself on the organizing committee, along with Father Robert, Sarah Wickham, and several others. They met in the evenings to coordinate and plan, and these meetings became occasions of laughter and camaraderie. It felt good to be working towards something joyful, something life-affirming. Daniel had been asked to repair the market cross for the occasion, replacing stones that had cracked and fallen away. Margaret would often find excuses to walk by while he was working, and they would talk for a few minutes. These brief conversations became highlights of her day. On the evening before Midsummer, there was a final flurry of preparation. Everyone was working, hanging decorations, setting up tables, preparing food. The sense of anticipation was palpable, a fizzing energy that seemed to electrify the air. As the sun set, Margaret stood at the edge of the green, watching it all come together. Father Robert came to stand beside her. It's extraordinary, isn't it? He said, that we're here, doing this. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have thought it possible. Neither would I, Margaret agreed. But here we are. The plague took so much from us, the priest said quietly. But perhaps it also gave us something. A deeper appreciation for life, for each other, for these ordinary moments that are actually quite extraordinary when you stop to think about it. Margaret considered this. Perhaps, though I'd gladly give that lesson back if I could have my sister again, if all those who died could return. Of course, Father Robert said. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. The cost was too high, far too high. But still, we're here, and we have a choice about what we do with that. Midsummer Day dawned clear and bright. By mid-morning, the entire village had gathered on the green. There was a service first, led by Father Robert, honoring those who had died and giving thanks for those who remained. Many wept during the service, but there was also a sense of release, as if in naming and acknowledging their grief, they were finally able to begin letting it go. After the service, the celebration began in earnest. There was food and drink, music and dancing. Children raced about, their faces painted with berry juice, shrieking with delight. Young people flirted and laughed. Older folks sat on benches, watching it all with satisfaction. Margaret found herself swept up in it all. She danced with Father Robert, and with Thomas Wickham, and with old James Holbrook, who proved surprisingly light on his feet. And then Daniel was there, bowing slightly and extending his hand. "I would," she said, placing her hand in his. They danced together as the sun moved toward evening, as the music swelled and the laughter rose around them. When the dance ended, he didn't immediately release her. Instead, he said quietly, "Margaret, I wonder if I might call on you. Properly, I mean." She felt a flutter in her chest, part excitement, part fear. Yes, I'd like that." His face broke into a smile of pure joy. "Then I will." As the celebration continued into the evening, Margaret felt as if she were floating. She had thought that part of her life was over, that love and romance were things that belonged to her past. That night, after the festival had ended and she had returned home, Margaret sat at her window looking out at the village. The green was littered with the debris of celebration flower petals, abandoned cups, a forgotten garland. Tomorrow, people would gather to clean it all up, to restore order. But for now, it stood as evidence of life lived, of joy experienced, of a community coming back together. Over the following weeks, Daniel did indeed call on her, and a courtship began. It was different from her first courtship, all those years ago, but perhaps that made it sweeter, more precious. They would walk together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the water flow past, Daniel said, "I never thought I'd feel this way again. I couldn't imagine ever caring for someone again." "But you do now?" Margaret asked softly. "I do." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "I care for you, Margaret, more than I ever expected to care for anyone again. And it terrifies me, because you're afraid of losing again. Yes, aren't you?" She was quiet for a moment, watching a water bird skim across the surface of the river. "We're always at risk of losing what we love. So we love anyway," Daniel said. Despite the risk. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Golden rose, and Margaret felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't known in years. The summer wore on, and the village continued its recovery. Margaret's work as clerk kept her busy, as did her courtship with Daniel. But she also found time to reconnect with old friends and make new ones. She began meeting regularly with a group of women: Sarah Wickham, Mary Thornton, Elizabeth Ashford, and several others, to share skills and support. These gatherings became a source of strength and comfort for all of them. "It's strange," Mary said one afternoon as they sat together carding wool. "Before the plague, I knew everyone in the village, of course. But I didn't really know them, if you understand what I mean. We were friendly but not close. Now, after everything we've been through together, I feel connected to you all in a deeper way." "Shared suffering creates bonds," Elizabeth observed. "We've seen each other at our worst and our best. There's no pretense left." "No pretense," Sarah agreed. "And that's actually freeing, in a way. We don't have to pretend to be anything other than what we are: broken people trying to heal, survivors trying to build new lives." These conversations reminded Margaret of how much the plague had changed not just individual people, but the very fabric of the community. The old hierarchies and formalities had been swept away, replaced by something more genuine and egalitarian. Status mattered less than character. Titles mattered less than deeds. She saw this especially in how the village was organizing itself for the future. A council had been formed, made up of representatives from different parts of the community. Unlike before the plague, when the council had been composed entirely of wealthy men, this new council included women, younger people, and those of more modest means. Father Robert chaired the meetings, but decisions were made collectively. Margaret attended these meetings in her role as clerk, recording the decisions and discussions. She was impressed by the thoughtfulness and care that went into the deliberations. People had learned something from the plague years, that they were all in this together, that the welfare of the community depended on the welfare of each individual. In August, the council took up the question of the empty houses, those that had belonged to plague victims who had left no heirs. What should be done with them? Some argued they should be sold, with the proceeds going to the church or to the poor. Others suggested they should be given to young couples starting families, or to newcomers willing to settle in Millbrook. After much debate, the council decided on a mixed approach. Some houses would be sold, some would be given to those in need, and some would be held in reserve for future use. Margaret recorded each decision carefully, knowing that these determinations would shape the village for years to come. It was during one of these council meetings that Daniel stood up to speak. He had been invited to attend as someone who had been doing significant work on village infrastructure. "I have a proposal," he said. "Many of the cottages and buildings need repair, as we all know. But rather than having me work on them haphazardly, as I've been doing, what if we create a more systematic plan? We could prioritize the repairs based on need and safety. And we could establish an apprenticeship program, teaching young people the skills needed to maintain and build. That way, the village won't be dependent on outside help in the future." The proposal was met with enthusiasm. A committee was formed to work with Daniel on the plan, and soon a systematic program of repair and rebuilding was underway. 3 young men signed on as apprentices, eager to learn the stonemason's craft. Watching Daniel work with his apprentices, Margaret felt a surge of admiration and affection. He was patient and thorough, taking time to explain not just how to do something, but why it was done that way. The young men clearly respected him, hanging on his words, eager to learn. "You're good with them," she told him one evening. He shrugged, looking pleased but embarrassed. "I remember how my father taught me." He believed that a true craftsman wasn't just skilled with his hands, but understood the principles behind the work. "I'm trying to pass that on. You're doing more than teaching a trade," Margaret said. "You're giving them purpose, a sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. That's valuable, especially for young men who've grown up through such dark times." "We all need purpose," Daniel said. "I know I do. Working with stone, building and repairing, teaching these lads, it helps me feel connected to the future. It helps me believe that what I do matters." In September, Margaret and Daniel attended the Harvest Festival together. It had been a good growing season, the first truly good season since before the plague, and the harvest was abundant. The church was decorated with sheaves of grain and bundles of vegetables, a testament to the earth's generosity and the farmer's hard work. As Father Robert led the service, giving thanks for the harvest, Margaret found herself overwhelmed with emotion. They had survived. Against all odds, against all the death and suffering, they had survived and were beginning to thrive again. The village would never be what it had been before the plague. Too much had been lost. Too much had changed. But it was becoming something else, something perhaps even stronger than before. After the service, as people gathered for the harvest feast, Daniel drew Margaret aside. His expression was serious, even nervous. "Margaret, there's something I want to ask you," he said. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, but I wanted to wait for the right moment." Her heart began to beat faster. "Yes?" He took both her hands in his. "I know we've both loved and lost before. I know we both carry scars. But I've come to care for you deeply, and I hope that you feel the same way about me." "I do," she said softly. Then ... Would you consider marrying me? Building a life together? I know it's a risk, loving again. But I think I believe that you're worth the risk. That we're worth the risk. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. Yes, she said. Yes, Daniel. I will marry you. He pulled her into an embrace, and she felt his chest shake with emotion. When they finally stepped apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. They announced their engagement at the harvest feast, and the entire village celebrated with them. It felt like more than just a personal milestone. It felt like a symbol of the village's renewal, proof that life and love continued even after the darkest times. The wedding was set for October, and the preparations became a community affair. Sarah Wickham baked the wedding cake. Mary Thornton provided honey for the mead. Elizabeth Ashford helped Margaret prepare her dress, altering a gown that had belonged to Margaret's mother. The night before the wedding, Margaret's women friends gathered at her cottage for a small celebration. They drank wine and shared stories, laughing and crying by turns. I never thought I'd see you marry again, Sarah said. After your husband died, you seemed so ... closed off. I was, Margaret admitted. I didn't think I could survive another loss. But then I realized that I wasn't really surviving at all. I was just existing. Daniel, he makes me want to really live again. That's what love should do, Elizabeth said. Not make you forget your grief, but give you reason to move forward despite it. I'll still miss my sister, Margaret said quietly. Every day, and my husband. The grief doesn't go away. No, Mary agreed, but it changes. It becomes part of you rather than something that consumes you. And you learn to carry it alongside joy instead of letting it crowd everything else out. The wedding took place on a crisp October afternoon, with the leaves turning gold and red around them. Father Robert performed the ceremony in the church, with the entire village in attendance. As Margaret spoke her vows, looking into Daniel's eyes, she felt as if she were stepping into a new life, not leaving her old life behind, but building something new, alongside the memories of what had been. After the ceremony, there was feasting and dancing on the green. It was a smaller, simpler celebration than Midsummer had been, but no less joyful. As Margaret danced with her new husband, she caught sight of familiar faces around her, people who had survived with her, who had endured the same darkness and emerged on the other side. She thought of all the stories she had collected in her role as clerk, all the tales of loss and survival. Each person here had their own story, their own burden of grief, their own path to healing. Together, they formed a tapestry of resilience, a living testament to the human capacity to endure. As autumn deepened and winter approached, Margaret settled into married life. She and Daniel had decided to live in her cottage, which was larger than his rented rooms. They spent their evenings by the fire, talking and reading, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Margaret continued her work as clerk, and the record she was building became increasingly comprehensive and detailed. She took pride in the work, knowing that she was creating something that would outlast her, that would serve as a historical record for future generations. One day in late November, a young woman came to see her. Her name was Hannah Carter, and she was one of the orphans the plague had created. Both her parents and her older brother had died in the early days of the sickness. She had been taken in by an aunt in a neighboring village, but had recently returned to Millbrook to marry Thomas Wickham. Mrs. Merrick, Hannah said. Margaret still wasn't quite used to her new name. I wanted to ask you something. I've heard about the records you're keeping, about how you're documenting what happened during the plague years. Yes, Margaret said. What about them? Hannah looked down at her hands. I wonder if... That is, I'd like to tell you about my family, about my parents and my brother, so that they're not just names in a book, but people with stories. Would that be all right? Of course, Margaret said, touched. I'd be honored to record their stories. And so Hannah told her about John and Ellen Carter, who had been kind and loving parents, and about Robert, her brother, who had dreamed of being a blacksmith. She spoke for more than an hour, painting a picture of three people who had lived and loved and then died before their time. Margaret recorded it all carefully, and when Hannah left, she felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever. This was more than just record keeping. It was a form of resurrection, a way of ensuring that those who had died would not be entirely forgotten. Over the following months, others came to her with similar requests. They wanted their loved ones remembered not just as death statistics, but as individuals. Margaret recorded their stories with care and reverence, building a memorial in words to all those who had been lost. Winter settled over Millbrook, but it was a different kind of winter than the plague years had brought. There was hardship still, cold and hunger were constants in any winter. But there was also warmth and community. People helped each other, sharing resources and support. The darkness was just darkness now, not a metaphor for death and despair. On Christmas Eve, the entire village gathered in the church for midnight mass. As the candles were lit and the familiar carols were sung, Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. 3 years ago, they had gathered in this same church, frightened and desperate, not knowing who among them would be next to fall to the plague. Now they gathered in hope and thanksgiving, celebrating not just Christ's birth, but their own survival and renewal. After the service, as she and Daniel walked home through the snow, he said, "This has been a good year. Difficult in many ways, but good." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "We've come a long way, and we have a long way still to go. But I'm glad I'm walking that path with you." She squeezed his hand. "As am I." The new year arrived, bringing with it new challenges and new joys. In January, Sarah Wickham's daughter gave birth to a healthy baby boy, the first birth in the village in more than 6 months. The whole village celebrated as if he were their own child, this small symbol of life continuing. In February, the council approved a plan to rebuild the school, which had closed during the plague when the schoolmaster died. A new teacher was hired, a young man from a neighboring town who was enthusiastic and dedicated. By March, a dozen children were attending classes, learning to read and write and cipher. Margaret was asked to speak to the students about the importance of record keeping and history. She told them about her work, about how she was documenting not just dates and facts, but the stories of real people who had lived through extraordinary times. "Someday," she told them, "you'll be the ones keeping records, telling stories, preserving history. What you remember and record will shape how future generations understand this time we're living through." That's a sacred trust. The children listened with wide eyes, and afterward, several of them peppered her with questions. Margaret left feeling hopeful about the future. These children, who had lived through the plague, who had seen death and loss, would grow up to build a new world. What kind of world would they create? She couldn't know, but she could help give them the tools and knowledge they would need. As spring returned, the second spring after the plague's end, Millbrook was barely recognizable from what it had been a year earlier. The fields were all planted and green with growing things. The empty houses had nearly all been repaired and reoccupied. The market was thriving. New babies had been born. New marriages celebrated. Life had returned. But it was not the same life that had existed before the plague. The village was different now, shaped by loss, but also by resilience. People valued things differently. They held each other closer. They appreciated ordinary moments more deeply. They had learned the fragility of life and the importance of community. Margaret continued her work as clerk, but she also began a new project. She started writing a history of the plague years, not just a chronicle of deaths and dates. It was difficult work, forcing her to revisit painful memories. She wanted them to know the human story. Daniel supported her in this work, as he supported her in everything. Their marriage had deepened over the months, becoming a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. But they had learned to talk through their differences with honesty and kindness. One evening in May, As they sat together working, Margaret on her history, Daniel sketching plans for a new barn, he looked up and said, "Margaret considered this. Sometimes. But I think we wouldn't have been the people we are now. The plague changed us, shaped us. And you might still be in London, living your old life." "True," Daniel said. "The plague destroyed so much, but it also created possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise." "I don't think it's about good coming from death," Margaret said slowly. "It's about what we choose to do with what remains." "A village reborn," Daniel said. "Yes, a village reborn." As summer approached, Margaret learned she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of emotions, joy, certainly, but also fear. She was 44 years old, past the age when most women had children. She confided these fears to Daniel, who held her close and said, "We'll face this together, whatever comes." Father Robert was equally encouraging when she told him. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "Of course you are. Any woman would be. But fear and joy often walk hand in hand. Don't let the fear rob you of the joy." The pregnancy progressed through the summer and into autumn. Margaret continued her work as long as she could, though eventually she had to slow down. In late October, on a night when the first frost was settling over the fields, Margaret went into labor. The village celebrated as if it were a royal birth. They named him Thomas, after Daniel's lost son and Margaret's late husband. It felt right to honor the past while embracing the future. As Margaret recovered from the birth and adjusted to motherhood, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. 3 years ago, she had been drowning in grief, unable to imagine any future worth living. Now she held new life in her arms, surrounded by a loving husband and a supportive community. The transformation seemed almost miraculous. But it hadn't been miraculous, she realized. It had been the result of countless small choices to continue living, to open her heart again, to invest in community, to believe in possibility. And those same choices were being made by everyone in Millbrook, every day. That was how a village was reborn, not through grand gestures or sudden transformations, but through the accumulated weight of small acts of courage and hope. Winter came again, but it felt less threatening now. They had stores of food laid by, wood for their fires and each other. Margaret would sit by the hearth, nursing little Thomas while Daniel worked on plans for spring projects, and she would feel a contentment so deep it almost frightened her. On Christmas Eve, they attended midnight mass again, this time carrying their son. As Margaret looked around the church at all the familiar faces marked by loss, but also by resilience and hope, she thought about everything they had endured together. The plague had taken so much, but it had not taken everything. It had not broken them. They had survived, and more than survived. They had found ways to thrive. As the new year began, Father Robert asked Margaret to read portions of her history at a special service commemorating the end of the plague years. It had been 3 years since the last death, 3 years of rebuilding and recovery. It seemed right to mark the occasion. Margaret stood before the congregation, her son sleeping in Daniel's arms, and read from her manuscript. She read about the arrival of the plague, about the fear and suffering, about the losses they had all endured. But she also read about the courage and compassion she had witnessed, about neighbors caring for neighbors, about people finding strength they hadn't known they possessed. "We are not the people we were before the plague," she read. "We have been changed by suffering, shaped by loss. But we have also been shaped by our response to that suffering. We chose to survive. We chose to rebuild. We chose to love again, even knowing the risks. And in those choices, we created something new, a community, bound not by proximity or tradition alone, but by shared experience and mutual care. This is our legacy. This is what we have built from the ashes of what was lost. A village reborn." When she finished reading, there was silence for a moment. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. Margaret saw tears on many faces and felt her own eyes fill as well. They had come through the darkness together, and they would face whatever future challenges arose together as well. As spring approached again, the third spring after the plague's end, Margaret returned to her regular work. Little Thomas was growing strong and healthy, a constant source of delight. Her history was nearly complete, and she was beginning to think about what project to take on next. The village continued to evolve and grow. New families arrived, drawn by stories of Millbrook's renewal. The apprenticeship program Daniel had started was training not just stonemasons, but carpenters and blacksmiths as well. The school was thriving, with 24 students now. The market attracted traders from neighboring towns, bringing prosperity back to the region. But there were also reminders that healing was an ongoing process, not a destination. Some people still struggled with grief and loss. Some had nightmares about the plague years. Some found it hard to trust in the future, fearing that disaster might strike again at any moment. Margaret tried to help where she could, offering a listening ear, practical assistance, or simply her presence. She had learned that healing happened in its own time, that you couldn't rush it or force it. All you could do was create space for it, support it, and trust that gradually, slowly, wholeness would return. One afternoon in late spring, Margaret was working in her garden when a stranger approached, a man of perhaps 50, travel-worn and weary. He introduced himself as Edmund Thorne, a merchant who had once done business in Millbrook, but had not returned since before the plague. "I heard the village had been struck hard by the sickness," he said. "I almost didn't come back. But then I heard it was recovering, and I thought ... I wanted to see for myself, to know if the stories were true." "What stories did you hear?" Margaret asked, gesturing for him to sit on the garden bench. That Millbrook had been devastated, but had rebuilt itself, that it was thriving again, that something new and good had emerged from the darkness. He looked around at the neat cottages, the tended gardens, the children playing on the green. "It seems the stories were true. We've worked hard," Margaret said. "All of us. But yes, we've come far. I knew many people here before," Edmund said. "Thomas Ashworth was a friend of mine. And his wife Margaret, I believe her name was. I am Margaret Ashworth," she said quietly, "though I've remarried. I'm Margaret Merrick now." Understanding dawned on Edmund's face. "I'm so sorry. Thomas was a good man." "He was. I miss him still. But I've found happiness again, which I think he would have wanted for me." They talked for a while longer, Edmund asking questions about who had survived and who had not, Margaret answering as gently as she could. Finally, he rose to leave. "Thank you for speaking with me," he said. "It helps to know that life continues, that good things can grow even after great tragedy." "Life always continues," Margaret said. "That's what we've learned. It may not continue in the way we expect or hope, but it continues nonetheless. Our task is to shape that continuation as best we can." After Edmund left, Margaret sat in her garden for a while longer, thinking about his words and her response. Life continues. It was such a simple statement, but it held profound truth. Life had continued through the plague, through loss, through despair, and it would continue into the future, shaped by the choices they made now. As the sun began to set, Daniel came home from his work, Thomas toddling beside him and chattering in the half-words of a young child learning to speak. Margaret stood and walked to meet them, and Daniel swept her into an embrace, while their son tugged at her skirts, demanding attention. This, she thought, was what they had rebuilt. Not just houses and roads and markets, but this love, family, connection. The ordinary, extraordinary moments that made life worth living. That evening, after Thomas was asleep and she and Daniel sat by the fire, Margaret added a final entry to her history. She wrote about how the village had changed, about what had been lost and what had been found. She wrote about the people who had died, and the people who had survived. And she wrote about hope, not the naive hope that believed everything would be fine, but the harder, deeper hope that believed life was worth living even when it was difficult, that love was worth risking even when it could be lost, that community was worth building even when it could be shattered. A village reborn, she wrote. Not perfect, not without scars, but alive and growing. We carry our dead with us, in memory and in love. But we also carry forward, creating new life, new stories, new possibilities. This is our testament. This is what we have made of what we were given. And it is enough. She set down her pen and looked at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in his chair, his face peaceful in the firelight. She looked around her cottage, at the home they had made together. She thought of their son sleeping upstairs, of the village beyond her walls, of all the people working and loving and hoping and struggling and surviving. They had come through the darkness. They had rebuilt from the ruins. They were still rebuilding, still healing, still learning how to live in this new world they were creating. It would be a lifelong process, she knew, this work of reconstruction and renewal. But they were doing it day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. And that was enough. That was everything. The fire burned low, and Margaret rose to add more wood. Outside, the stars were coming out, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The village slept around her, houses full of people dreaming their dreams, each carrying their own stories of loss and survival, each contributing to the ongoing work of building a future from the fragments of the past. Margaret thought of all those stories, all those lives, all those choices. She thought of the record she had kept, the history she had written, the child she had borne. She thought of the love she had found, and the love she had lost, and the love that continued, transforming but never ending. A village reborn. That was what they had created here, what they continued to create every day. Not by forgetting what had been, but by remembering it, honoring it, and still choosing to move forward. Not by denying their pain, but by living alongside it, letting it shape, but not define them. This was the lesson of the plague years, she realized. Not that suffering had meaning, she still couldn't believe that, but that survivors could create meaning from their survival. That from loss could come new forms of love. That from endings could come new beginnings. The fire crackled, and Thomas stirred in his sleep upstairs, and Daniel shifted in his chair, and beyond the cottage walls, the village breathed quietly in the darkness. Life continuing, always continuing. And in that continuation, in that persistent, stubborn refusal to surrender to despair, lay hope. Margaret stood by the window, looking out at the night, and felt a profound gratitude wash over her. For this life, for this moment, for the journey that had brought her here, and the future that lay ahead, uncertain but full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows. The work of rebuilding would continue, as it always must. But tonight, the village slept in peace, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.